The war had been going on for 10 long years, and the Kithra alliance was losing badly. 4 different alien races had joined together to fight, but it wasn't enough. The enemy they faced was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before. Commander. Veltan pressed his 6-fingered hand against the cold metal wall of his ship and watched through the window as his home planet died. Seralon had been beautiful once, with crystal cities that sparkled like diamonds and floating gardens that danced in the wind. Now dark clouds of smoke covered everything, and strange biomechanical creatures crawled across the surface like giant metal insects, eating everything in their path. The Nethrix horde was not like normal enemies. They didn't just want territory or resources. They wanted to consume everything living and turn it into more of themselves. Each creature in the horde was connected to all the others through some kind of shared mind. When one learned something new, they all learned it instantly. When the Alliance found a new weapon that worked, the Nethrix would adapt within hours, making that weapon useless. Veltan had seen this happen over and over again. His people had created powerful energy shields that could stop any known weapon. The Nethrix learned to phase through them. The Alliance built faster ships to outrun the enemy. The Nethrix grew wings and learned to fly through space without ships at all. Every time the Alliance thought they had found hope, the Nethrix took it away. Standing beside him on the bridge was his second-in-command, a young officer named Kethlin, who had never known peace. She had been born during the war and had spent her entire life running from one safe place to another, as the Nethrix slowly consumed the galaxy. "Sir, we're receiving the final evacuation reports," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "The transport ships have picked up everyone they could find, but there are still millions of people down there who couldn't make it to the pickup points in time." Veltan closed his eyes. 3 billion people lived on Seralon. His own family was somewhere down there in the chaos. His elderly parents who had refused to leave their home. His sister who worked as a doctor and wouldn't abandon her patients. His childhood friends, his former teachers, everyone he had ever known and loved. The evacuation ships could only hold so many people. They had saved maybe 50,000. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was all they could do. The Nethrix were already landing on the planet's surface, and their bioships were surrounding the world like a dark metal cloud. "Send out the final distress signal," Veltan ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Use all frequencies, all languages. Tell anyone listening that the Kithara alliance has fallen and that the Nethrix horde continues to advance. Warn them to stay away from our former territory." As the message was transmitted into the empty void of space, Veltan wondered if anyone would even receive it. Most of the other civilizations in this part of the galaxy had already been destroyed or had fled to safer regions far away. The few species that remained were probably too weak to help or too smart to try. The jump to hyperspace felt different this time. Usually entering hyperspace was exciting, like diving into a river of stars. This time it felt like dying. They were leaving everything behind forever, and they all knew it. When they arrived at Sanctuary Station 3 days later, the reality of their situation became clear. The station was built inside a hollow asteroid in a remote part of space that most people had forgotten about. It was supposed to be temporary, just a place to rest and plan their next move. But looking at the faces of the survivors, Veltan realized this might be their final home. Elder Thisera, the oldest and wisest leader of the Alliance, gathered all the survivors in the station's main hall. She was over 300 years old and had lived through many wars, but none like this one. Her usually bright purple skin had turned pale gray from stress and sadness. "My people," she began, her voice echoing through the crowded room, "we have lost our worlds, but we have not lost ourselves. We must stay strong and keep hope alive." But even as she spoke these words, everyone could see the truth in her ancient eyes. The Nethrix were still out there, still growing stronger, still consuming everything in their path. Sanctuary Station might be hidden for now, but it wouldn't stay hidden forever. The Horde would find them eventually, just like they had found everyone else. In the weeks that followed, scouts reported that the Nethrix had completely consumed the Kithara worlds and were now moving toward the last remaining civilizations in their sector. Soon there would be nowhere left to run. The Alliance was dying, and everyone knew it. 3 months had passed since the fall of Cerelon, and life at Sanctuary Station had settled into a grim routine. Every day brought the same depressing reports from their long-range scouts. The Nethrix horde was still out there, consuming world after world, growing stronger with each victory. The refugees had begun to accept that they were simply waiting to die. Elder Thisara spent most of her time in the station's communication center, listening to the final transmissions from dying civilizations across the galaxy. The Zephyrian Empire had fallen 2 weeks ago. The Crystalline Collective had gone silent 5 days after that. Each lost voice made the universe feel a little smaller, a little darker. That's why nobody believed the transmission when it first came through. It was a weak signal, crackling with static, coming from a sector that should have been completely overrun by the Nethrix weeks ago. The voice speaking was using a language that their computers barely recognized, something called English, from a species that called themselves humans. This is Captain Li Jun of the human vessel Phoenix, calling any survivors in the area. We have successfully repelled a Nethrix assault fleet and are offering assistance to any refugees in need. The communications officer, a young Kithara named Zeftai, stared at his screen in confusion. Elder, should I respond? This has to be some kind of mistake. No one survives a Nethrix assault. Thisara studied the transmission data. The signal was definitely coming from the Kepler sector, an area that had been marked as completely lost 3 weeks earlier. According to their records, humans were a primitive species that had only figured out faster than light travel about 50 years ago. They barely had any colonies outside their home system. Respond, she said finally. But be careful. This could be a trap. What happened next changed everything they thought they knew about the war. Captain Li Jun arrived at Sanctuary Station 4 days later with a small fleet of 12 ships. When the Kythera got their first look at the human vessels, many of them laughed. The ships looked like they had been built in someone's garage. They were blocky, ugly, and covered in strange symbols that turned out to be something humans called graffiti. Compared to the sleek, elegant warships of the Alliance, they looked like flying junk. But there was something in the way these crude ships moved that made Commander Veltan pay attention. They didn't fly in perfect formations like proper military vessels. Instead, they seemed to dance through space, each ship moving independently, but somehow staying coordinated, like a school of fish avoiding a predator. Captain Li Jun himself was even more surprising than his ships. He was young, probably not even 30 years old in human terms, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to see everything at once. When he walked into the station's meeting room, he didn't bow politely, like most species did when meeting elders. Instead, he gave a casual wave and dropped into a chair without waiting for permission. "So," he said, looking around the room at the assembled Kythara leaders, "I hear you folks have been having some trouble with the metal bugs." Elder Thisara was so shocked by his informal attitude that she almost forgot to activate the translation device. In all her 300 years, no one had ever spoken to her so casually. But there was something about this young human that made her want to listen. "You claim to have defeated a Nethrix fleet," she said carefully. "Our records show that no species has ever accomplished this. How is it possible?" Li Jun reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device that projected holographic images into the air above the table. The images showed a battle unlike anything the Kythara had ever seen. Human ships were diving directly at Nethrix vessels, ramming them, exploding against their hulls, doing things that no sane military commander would ever order. "The thing about the Nethrix," Li said as the images played, "is that they're really, really smart. They learn from every battle, adapt to every strategy, counter every weapon. They've figured out how to beat every logical, sensible, well-planned military operation in the galaxy." He paused the hologram on an image of a human ship spinning wildly through space, firing weapons in all directions, while Nethrix creatures tried desperately to catch it. "But here's the thing they haven't figured out yet," Li continued with a grin. "What do you do when your enemy doesn't follow any logical plan at all?" Commander Veltan studied the battle records more carefully. The human tactics made no sense from a military standpoint. They wasted ammunition, put their ships in unnecessary danger, and seemed to make important decisions based on pure instinct. Rather than careful planning, "Your tactics are completely illogical," he said finally. Captain Lee's grin got wider. "Exactly. And that's why they work." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. For 10 years, the Alliance had tried to fight the Nethrix using proper military strategy, careful planning and logical thinking. They had failed completely. But these humans, these primitives who barely knew how to build spaceships, had succeeded. By doing everything wrong, it was impossible. It was insane. And apparently it was the only thing that worked. When Captain Lee Jun announced his plan to attack Nethrix Prime directly, the entire command room at Sanctuary Station went completely silent. Even the humming of the air recyclers seemed to stop. Every single Kithara officer stared at him like he had just suggested they all jump out of an airlock without spacesuits. Nethrix Prime was the heart of the enemy empire, a massive system with hundreds of bioships, millions of Nethrix creatures, and defenses that had never been breached in the entire 10-year war. It was the one place in the galaxy that every military strategist agreed was absolutely impossible to attack. Even thinking about it was considered a waste of time. "You want to do what?" Commander Veltan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Attack. Their home base," Lee repeated cheerfully, as if he was suggesting they go out for lunch. "Hit them where they live. Take out their main production facilities and command centers." Elder Thisara felt her ancient heart skip several beats. "Captain Jun, with respect, that is not just dangerous, it is suicide. The Nethrix Prime system has defenses that could destroy 1,000 fleets. No military force in galactic history has ever even attempted such an assault." "Good," said Lee with that same unsettling grin. "That means they won't expect it." 3 days later, Commander Park Sung arrived with additional human reinforcements and took over the tactical planning. She was different from Captain Lee, more serious and focused, but just as terrifying in her own way. When she spread out the holographic battle plans in the station's war room, the Kithara officers couldn't believe what they were seeing. The attack patterns looked like they had been designed by someone who had never studied military strategy in their entire life. Ships were supposed to attack in formation, maintaining safe distances and providing cover for each other. The human plan showed vessels diving in alone, splitting up randomly, and deliberately putting themselves in the most dangerous positions possible. "This formation will result in massive casualties," Veltan pointed out, his voice shaking. "You're sending ships directly into the enemy's strongest defensive positions, with no backup and no escape routes." Park Sung nodded calmly. "That's the idea. The Nethrix have spent 10 years learning how to counter every reasonable military strategy. They know exactly how to respond when an enemy tries to minimize losses and preserve their forces. They've programmed their collective consciousness to predict and counter logical tactics." She zoomed in on one section of the hologram where human ships were shown charging straight at a massive Nethrix defense platform. But what happens when the enemy does something that makes no logical sense at all? What happens when they can't predict your next move because even you don't know what you're going to do next? The Kithara officers looked at each other with growing horror. This wasn't military strategy. This was organized madness. As the combined human and Kithara fleet prepared to leave Sanctuary Station, Lieutenant Kim Hana began training sessions to prepare the Alliance soldiers for what was coming. The training exercises took place in the station's largest cargo bay, which had been converted into a mock battle arena. What the Kithara witnessed there would haunt their dreams for years to come. Human soldiers were practicing combat scenarios that seemed designed to get them killed as quickly as possible. They would charge directly at mock enemy positions, screaming at the top of their lungs, firing weapons in all directions, and making decisions that no sane being would ever make in actual combat. "Remember," Kim Hana shouted over the noise of simulated explosions, "the goal isn't to follow the plan. The goal is to confuse the enemy so badly that they can't adapt fast enough to stop you. If you find yourself doing something that makes perfect sense, you're doing it wrong." One group of human Marines was practicing something they called a berserker charge, where they would run directly at the enemy while making loud, terrifying noises. Another group was learning to fight while spinning in circles, making their movements completely unpredictable. A third group was practicing how to use their own ships as weapons, ramming them into enemy vessels at the last possible second. The Kithara Marines who were supposed to learn these techniques watched in fascination and terror. Everything they had been taught about combat, everything they knew about survival, told them that these humans were completely insane. "Why do you scream when you attack?" asked Zeftai, the young communications officer who had volunteered for combat training. "Doesn't that give away your position?" Kim Hana grinned and let out a blood-curdling war cry that echoed through the entire cargo bay. "Because it scares the hell out of the enemy. The Nethrix have fought thousands of species, but they've never fought anyone who enjoys battle. They don't know how to process an enemy that gets excited about fighting instead of afraid." Hilda Thisera watched these training sessions from the observation deck above the cargo bay and slowly began to understand something that changed her entire view of the war. For 10 years, the Alliance had tried to fight the Nethrix using logic, planning, and careful strategy. They had approached war like a chess game, trying to think several moves ahead and minimize their losses. But humans didn't see war as a chess game. They saw it as something wild and unpredictable, something that couldn't be controlled or planned for. They embraced the chaos instead of fighting against it. The Nethrix collective consciousness was incredibly intelligent, but it was still a computer-like mind that relied on patterns and predictions. It could adapt to any logical strategy because logic followed rules, but chaos had no rules. Madness couldn't be predicted or countered because it changed constantly, even from moment to moment. As the fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace for the journey to Nethrix Prime, Thisara realized that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their ships or their guns. It was their willingness to do things that no rational being would ever do, to embrace insanity as a battle tactic. The Kithara had always believed that intelligence and careful planning were the keys to victory. The humans were about to prove that sometimes the best strategy was to have no strategy at all. The battle for Nethrix Prime began exactly as Commander Park Sung had promised it would, with complete and utter chaos. The combined human and Kithara fleet dropped out of hyperspace right in the middle of the enemy's home system, appearing directly between two massive Nethrix defense platforms that should have been impossible to approach undetected. Every military manual in the galaxy said you were supposed to arrive at the edge of a system and carefully scout your way inward. The humans had just thrown that rule out the window. "Contact!" shouted Lieutenant Bei Jungwoo from his position at the sensor station aboard the human flagship Indomitable. "We've got Nethrix bioships coming at us from all directions, at least 300 vessels, with more launching from the surface installations." Captain Song Minky stood calmly in the center of the bridge, watching the tactical display as red dots representing enemy ships surrounded his fleet like angry hornets. Any normal commander would have ordered an immediate retreat. The odds were impossible, 300 enemy ships against their modest force of 50 vessels. Instead, Captain Song smiled and activated the ship's communication system. "All ships, this is Indomitable. Execute Plan Chaos. I repeat, execute Plan Chaos." What happened next would be talked about in military academies for the next 1,000 years, assuming anyone survived to build military academies. The human ships immediately split apart in all directions, abandoning any attempt at formation flying. Some dove directly toward the planet's surface, others spun wildly through space firing in random directions, and a few actually turned around and flew directly at the largest Nethrix battleships. Commander Veltan, watching from the bridge of the Kithara vessel Starlight, felt his stomach drop. They've lost their minds. This isn't a battle plan, it's suicide. But as the first wave of Nethrix creatures reached the scattered human ships, something incredible happened. The biomechanical monsters, which had adapted to counter every logical military strategy in the galaxy, simply didn't know what to do. The Nethrix collective consciousness had been programmed to respond to predictable attack patterns. When enemies approached in formation, it knew exactly how to position its forces. When they tried to outflank or retreat, it could predict their movements and cut them off. But when the enemy split up randomly and started doing things that made no sense at all, the Hive mind began to hesitate. Engineer Nam Soo-jin was working frantically at her station aboard the Indomitable, monitoring weapons systems that no other species had ever seen before. While everyone else in the galaxy had focused on building bigger energy weapons and stronger shields, humans had taken a completely different approach. "Magnetic pulse harpoons ready," she called out, as a massive Nethrix bioship approached their position. Target locked. The weapon that fired wasn't like anything the Kithara had ever seen. Instead of a beam or projectile, it launched what looked like a glowing net made of pure magnetic energy. When it hit the bioship, the creature's entire energy matrix began to fluctuate wildly. "Compression fields activated," Nam Sujin announced calmly, as if she was discussing the weather. "Initiating matter collapse sequence." The Nethrix creature, which moments before had been a terrifying predator the size of a small moon, suddenly began shrinking. Its biomechanical body compressed smaller and smaller until it collapsed into a tiny ball of dense matter, then winked out of existence entirely. Throughout the battle zone, similar scenes were playing out as human ships used weapons that seemed to have been designed specifically to counter Nethrix biology. Sonic disruptors that confused their collective consciousness. Quantum scramblers that made their adaptive armor useless. Paradox generators that fed the hive mind logical impossibilities until it shut down from overload. Lieutenant Kim Hana was leading a boarding party onto one of the larger Nethrix vessels, and her team was demonstrating the most terrifying aspect of human warfare, their complete lack of fear. While Kithara soldiers were trained to be cautious and preserve their lives, human Marines seemed to actively seek out the most dangerous situations possible. "Remember," she shouted to her team as they cut through the bioship's hull, "these things can read our thoughts if we think too logically, so don't think at all, just react." What followed was less like a military operation and more like a pack of wild animals rampaging through the enemy ship. The human Marines didn't follow standard corridor clearing procedures. Instead, they ran through the bioship making loud noises, shooting at anything that moved, and generally causing as much chaos as possible. The Nethrix creatures inside the ship, which had been designed to counter organized military assaults, had no idea how to respond to what appeared to be a group of insane beings having some kind of violent party in their corridors. Back on the Indomitable's bridge, Lieutenant Bei Jungwoo was tracking the overall battle with growing amazement. "Captain, the Nethrix are pulling back. They're actually retreating from their own home system." Captain Song nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected. "Pursuit course. Don't let them regroup." This was perhaps the most shocking part of the entire battle. Not only had the humans survived the initial assault, not only had they fought the Nethrix to a standstill, but they were actually chasing them. A single human warship was pursuing an entire fleet of bioships that were fleeing in terror from their own home. Elder Thisara watched the battle from her position aboard the Kithara command ship, and she finally understood what made humans so dangerous. Every other species in the galaxy fought wars to defend their territory, protect their people, or gain resources. They saw war as a necessary evil, something to be ended as quickly as possible with minimal losses. But humans seemed to see war as a kind of art form. They fought not just to win, but to completely dominate their enemies psychologically. They didn't just want to defeat the Nethrix, they wanted to break their collective consciousness, make them afraid, teach them that there were things in the universe that couldn't be adapted to or overcome. As the last Nethrix bioships fled toward the outer system, their collective hive mind broadcasting panic signals that could be heard across subspace, Thisara realized that the war was essentially over. Not because the humans had better technology or superior numbers, but because they had introduced something into the conflict that the Nethrix simply couldn't process, the concept of an enemy that got stronger and more dangerous the more desperate. The situation became: the Nethrix had evolved to fight civilized species that valued logic and life. They had never encountered anything like humanity, a species that seemed to thrive on chaos and view impossible odds as an invitation to party. 1 year had passed since the impossible victory at Nethrix Prime, and the galaxy barely recognized itself anymore. Where once there had been only despair and the constant fear of biomechanical horrors consuming everything in their path, now there was something that most species had forgotten even existed: hope. Admiral Yun Seo stood at the massive observation window in what used to be Sanctuary Station's refugee center. The cramped emergency shelters had been torn out and replaced with a state-of-the-art command center that coordinated rescue operations across 3 entire galactic sectors. Ships came and went at all hours, carrying supplies to rebuilding worlds, or racing off to answer distress calls from species that had never heard of humanity just months before. The transformation was remarkable. Sanctuary Station had grown from a hidden asteroid hideout into the bustling headquarters of the Human Intervention Corps, an organization that hadn't existed 2 years ago, but was now the most respected military force in the galaxy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The youngest species in known space had become everyone's protector. "Admiral," called Lieutenant Park Jisoo from her communication station, "we're receiving a priority distress signal from the Altair system. The Christine Collective is reporting that survivors from the old Zephyrian Empire have been trapped on a dead world for 8 months. They're running out of food and their life support systems are failing." Yoon Seo didn't hesitate. "Dispatch the Seoul and the Busan immediately. Full humanitarian loadout. And tell Captain Lee Minho to take the scenic route through the Vortex Nebula. His crew enjoys the challenge." This was how things worked now. Somewhere in the galaxy, people were in trouble, and humans would drop everything to help them. It didn't matter if the species was one they'd never encountered before, or if the rescue mission required flying through dangerous space that would terrify any sensible pilot. If someone needed help, the Human Intervention Corps would find a way to provide it. Elder Thisara, now serving as the first alien advisor to the Corps, watched the controlled chaos of the command center with a mixture of amazement and amusement. At over 300 years old, she had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations, but she had never seen anything quite like what humanity had built. "Your people continue to amaze me," she said to Admiral Yoon, her ancient voice filled with wonder. 6 months ago, the hegemony of Tarkellen sent a formal request for military assistance against pirates. They expected you to send a single ship, perhaps 2 at most. Instead, you dispatched an entire battle group and stayed until every single pirate base in their territory was eliminated. Yoon Seo smiled, remembering that particular operation. Captain Kim Young-soo said his crew was getting bored with routine patrol missions. They specifically requested something with more excitement. This was perhaps the most difficult thing for other species to understand about humans. Most civilizations saw military service as a duty, something necessary but unpleasant. Humans seemed to view it as an adventure, an opportunity to test themselves against impossible odds and help people in the process. They volunteered for the most dangerous missions, complained when things were too quiet, and celebrated victories by immediately looking for the next challenge. The results spoke for themselves. In just 1 year, the Human Intervention Corps had responded to over 400 emergency situations. They had evacuated populations from dying worlds, fought off raider attacks, delivered medical supplies to plague-stricken colonies, and even helped settle territorial disputes between species that had been fighting for decades. Commander Veltan, who now served as the liaison between the reconstructed Kithara Defense Corps and the Human Intervention Corps, approached the observation window carrying a datapad filled with the latest reports. "Admiral, I have the weekly summary of Corps activities," he said, still slightly amazed by what he was reading. "This week alone, your ships responded to 17 separate incidents across 12 different star systems. The crew of the Incheon successfully rescued a research team that had been stranded in a black hole's event horizon for 3 months, something that our physicists still insist should be impossible." "Captain Song Ji-won has always been creative with physics," Yoon Seo replied casually. "What else?" The Daegu completed the evacuation of the Trelex homeworld ahead of schedule, saving an additional 50,000 civilians that other estimates said couldn't be reached in time. "And the Gwangju—" Veltan paused, shaking his head in disbelief. The Gwangju apparently discovered a new method of faster-than-light travel while chasing pirates through an unstable wormhole. They're calling it combat surfing. This was typical of human operations. They didn't just accomplish their missions. They somehow managed to exceed every expectation while accidentally discovering new scientific principles in the process. Other species planned their operations carefully, following established procedures and protocols. Humans treated each mission like a puzzle to be solved creatively, often coming up with solutions that no one else had ever thought of. The communication system crackled to life, and Captain Li Jun's voice filled the command center. He was somewhere in the Outer Rim, leading a task force to establish new supply bases for future rescue operations. Sanctuary Station, this is Phoenix Squadron. We've located the lost colony ships from the second migration. Turns out they've been hiding in a nebula for the past 50 years, completely cut off from galactic civilization. They have no idea the war is over. Yun Seo leaned over the communication console. What's their status, Captain? Scared, confused, and very relieved to see friendly faces. They've got about 30,000 people spread across 6 ships, including some species I've never seen before. We're going to need a full cultural integration team, and probably a few linguists who specialize in pre-war dialects. Already dispatched. The Mokpo is en route with everything you need. Estimated arrival in 18 hours. As the communication ended, Elder Thisara reflected on how much the galaxy had changed. Before the war, species rarely interacted with each other beyond basic trade relationships. Each civilization kept to itself, viewing others with suspicion or indifference. The Nethrix horde had changed all that by forcing everyone to face a common enemy, but it was humanity that had shown everyone what cooperation could accomplish. "Your people saved us when we had given up hope," she said quietly, watching another group of human ships depart on their next mission. Not through superior technology or ancient wisdom, but through something we had forgotten existed: the refusal to accept defeat, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. Admiral Yoon nodded, her gaze fixed on the stars beyond the observation window. "My grandmother used to tell me that hope is the last thing to die. We just decided to make sure it never gets the chance." The galaxy's youngest spacefaring species had become its most effective guardian, proving that sometimes salvation doesn't come from those who know the most, but from those who refuse to quit when everything seems lost. And as long as humans were willing to answer the call for help, no species would ever have to face extinction alone again. In the distance, more ships were preparing to launch, ready to race toward whatever crisis awaited them in the vast darkness of space. Retry Claude. Can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.